Thank you, Mark. Good evening to everybody. It's an honor for me to introduce NT Tom Wright. Now, this event, this will be his fourth lecture here since 2013, or since the creation of the world, either one. So we're so grateful that he has made it across the big pond to be with us tonight. As you see in your program, NT Wright is currently the Senior Research Fellow at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford in England. Before that, he was a professor of New Testament at the University of St. Andrews. Before that, he was the Bishop of Durham. Before that, I think he was at McGill or something. I'm not sure. He's got a long resume. He's got 83 books in our library. How many of you read all of them? Raise your hand. Okay, one person. Okay, that's pretty good. But it is a great honor for us to have him here, for him to speak. His title is really interesting. For those of us that have been around evangelical theology for a while, the Romans Road Through the Dark Valley. Join me in giving a Texas-sized welcome, please, to NT Tom Wright.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to Mark and Becky and to all those who've worked very hard to make this place and particularly this evening possible. And yes, it was very frustrating 2 years ago when we had to cancel or postpone. It was extremely frustrating last year because we really thought we were going to do it, because we thought that your president and my prime minister were going to make an agreement that said people can now fly between our two countries, which they should have done, but they didn't. So right up to the last minute, I was expecting to come, and then, of course, we weren't able to. But anyway, here we are, and that's terrific. And thank you for making it possible for so many people to be here. And a special word of thanks from me to Hannah Allen, who's organized the PowerPoint presentation. I don't do PowerPoint presentations. I'm about twice too old to do that sort of thing. So I always need somebody about a third of my own age or even younger, and they can just do it like that. So I'm very grateful to Hannah, and I hope that'll all go smoothly. Now, I suspect that you all know the phrase, the Romans Road, or three-quarters of you will anyway. Preachers and evangelists have often used this when helping people on their way into Christian faith. Here is a typical tract that sets it out. And the trick is to walk with inquirers through selected highlights of Paul's letter to the Romans until they're confronted with their own sin and its results, informed of the good news that Jesus died for them, and then being assured that if they believe the gospel, then they will be forgiven and they will go to heaven. If they accept, there you are, the free gift. And everything else, so people hope, will follow from there. Now, I have to say, there are worse things to do with an inquirer than to point them to Paul's letter to Rome. It's actually a very good place to start for anything. I celebrate how God moves in many mysterious ways and uses many strange paths to bring people to faith and ultimately to salvation. If God waited until we got our theology and our exegesis all right, there wouldn't be many Christians left around. But as Luther found 5 centuries ago, and more recently Karl Barth found 100 or so years ago, once Romans gets its teeth into you, there will always be more to discover, and then more and more and more again. I began serious study of Romans about 50 years ago. It sounds very odd to say that, but it is true. I possess about 120 commentaries on Romans, and I've written 2 myself, plus dozens of articles and sections in other books. But I am still finding more and more, though actually what it feels like is that Romans is still finding me, probing my life and my teaching and alerting me to huge themes and small details that I'd missed. Saying that reminds me of what happened when I wrote my little book, Simply Jesus, which I guess was about 10, 15 years ago, I'm not sure when. And Maggie, my wife, said to me, "So what are you writing?" And I said, "I'm writing a book on Jesus." She said, "You've already written a book on Jesus. In fact, I think you've written 2 books on Jesus already." And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, has Jesus changed?" And my response was, "Well, no, but maybe I have." And I think that's what's going on with Romans still. And I'm one of the lucky ones. You know, I know a lot of academics who, by the time they're my age, are bored with their subject. with standing in front of students and going through the same stuff again and again. I have to say, in all honesty, and those of you who know me personally will know this to be true, I am as excited by this text now in my early 70s as I was in my early 20s. The text has that kind of a power and a grip. So sometimes this happens through careful scholarly study, that you are pushed into different positions, not least to my own embarrassment when my own students have pointed out things which I had missed. And some of what I'm going to say first dawned on me when my former doctoral student Haley Jacob showed me what she was finding in Romans 8, and I'm very grateful for Haley's work. You see, when you teach a text, there's her book, Conform to the Image of the Son. When you teach a text again and again, there's a temptation to become lazy. You assume that what you saw in the text last time around is what you need to tell them this time around. But we all need to be joggled out of our lazy exegetical habits, preachers, theologians, scholars alike. We need to be alert for things that we've missed before, and I'm grateful that that goes on happening to me. But changes in our readings and understandings also happen when we're confronted with serious problems and challenges to our faith. And something like that was happening 2 years ago when the pandemic first struck. People were asking, what's this all about? Why has God permitted it? Is it a sign of the end times? Is God punishing us for some specific sin? And my response then, in the little book which I wrote at the time, was to turn back to Romans 8 and to explore afresh Paul's account of living humbly and prayerfully within a world groaning in travail. But of course, the groaning in travail hasn't stopped. And I don't just mean that COVID is going on, though it is, but now we are faced with the horrible situation in Ukraine. And the Western world is shaken to its foundations in a way that hasn't happened really in my adult lifetime. I had an email this morning from a friend that Maggie and I have, who is a university teacher in Western Ukraine, in Lviv, and she and her daughters are currently refugees in Poland. Her husband is in Ukraine, still doing what men in Ukraine have to do, sadly, at the moment. But I sent her a copy of this lecture to say I'm going to be talking about how I think theologically we should be addressing what it is to live in a world in pain like this. And she was grateful and sent her greetings to you all. And so people ask, and then not only global things like Russia and Ukraine, but terrible local things like a shooting spree in a primary school. People say to me, why is this happening? What does it all mean? And how should we be praying? As with the pandemic, these crises generate apocalyptic speculators who in every generation claim that they can line up world events with prophecies in Daniel or Revelation or whatever and tell us where we are in some doomsday timeline or scenario. But as with my response to the pandemic 2 years ago, I want to say that's not the way. If we are confronted with a world in convulsions and we want to know how to pray, Romans 8 will show us the way, because the Romans road leads us down into the dark valley. And on the way, we will discover, perhaps to our surprise, more about who God himself actually is, and more about what it means that we are called to be genuine humans, called to share in God's work in the world. Because if we follow the Romans road, the actual one, not the truncated version, it will take us to many places we didn't expect. See, we modern Western Christians have regularly shrunk the question of Christianity to some oversimplified themes like, how do I get saved? How do I go to heaven? In fact, heaven in that sense isn't mentioned in Romans. Now, that's a shock for a start, because Paul's vision of salvation, like that of all other early Christians and of Jesus himself, was of God's kingdom becoming a reality on earth as in heaven. And Jesus' followers being called to be part of that glorious bipartite heaven and earth promised reality. So when Romans 8 talks about salvation, as it does, it places us on a road which, Like the road in Psalm 23 leads through the valley of the shadow, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. Romans takes us on that road. Or like the road in Psalm 84, through the valley of weeping, the valley of Baca, which is on the way up to the temple, and we are called to go through that valley and find refreshment even there. Because the goal is new creation, creation itself being saved, rescued, set free from the slavery of decay and death, and ourselves already indwelt by God's life-giving Spirit, promised that we will be part of that new world. So if we think, because the Romans road emphasizes justification by faith, that means that no moral effort is ever going to be required. Well, Romans 8, verses 12 and 13 will put us straight in no uncertain terms. There they are on the screen. And if we imagine that the way forward from faith to ultimate salvation is going to be a smooth, easy passage, well, Romans 8, verses 17 to 27 will tell us otherwise. We'll be looking at that in more detail. And if we suppose that because we are saved by grace, we humans have nothing to do other than lie back and let God do it all, the whole passage will tell us to wake up and smell the coffee. You see, Romans 8 is not just about the destination of God's people, those who have already believed the gospel concerning his son Jesus. It is about our present vocation. Our present vocation is the truly human vocation, our calling to be part of the renewed human race, which Paul sketched briefly towards the end of chapter 5 in that extraordinary, dense passage about Adam and Christ. See, our danger, particularly in the Protestant churches, is so to emphasize grace, God's initiative, God's sovereignty in all things, that we ignore or forget that when God made the world, he made humans specifically to reflect his image into the world. God intended and still intends to work in his world through human beings, ultimately through Jesus, the truly human one, above all, but then and because of that, through Jesus' people, the rescued, faithful, Spirit-led, genuine human people. So this passage thus gives us our agenda for being people who know the way through the dark valley that lies at the heart of the Romans road. Now, I want now to lay all this out for you in 3 stages, of which the first itself subdivides into a further 3. First, there is the unexpected vocation of God's people. Second, there is the paradoxical prayer life of God's people. And third, we see the dark disclosure of God and God's purposes. And these 3 points together will generate some final reflections on our calling to be people of prayer at this dangerous moment in world history. So first, the unexpected vocation. Who are we called to be? We who have found the gospel to be true in our own lives. We who have come to know the presence and the power of Jesus. Paul's answer, which still comes as a surprise to many, is that we are called to be genuine humans. As he says in Romans 5:17, those who receive the gift of righteousness will reign in life. And as in Revelation 5, verses 9 and 10, the death of the slaughtered lamb results not in humans leaving this world and going somewhere else, but in humans being rescued to become a kingdom and priests, God's royal priesthood, who will reign on the earth, genuine Genesis 1 style, image-bearing humans. But what form does this reign take, this human life to which we're called? And here is the unexpected triple vocation. First, we are the new temple, where God himself dwells by the Spirit. Second, we share the Messiah's inheritance, which is his lordship over all the earth. And third, this is exercised through our sharing in his cruciform vocation, his sorrow and suffering as the ongoing means by which God is healing and will remake his creation. And this call climaxes in the specific kind of prayer which Paul describes in verses 26 and 27. And those two verses on prayer are not an aside, as many have imagined. If you read the passage differently, you'll wonder, why did Paul stick those two verses in there about prayer? Rather odd verses too. No, they're not an aside, they are the climax. They take us to the dark heart of the Romans road. So, the first part of our vocation is to be the new temple. Earlier in the chapter, Paul talks about the Spirit indwelling believers. That's the language which Scripture, the Old Testament, uses to talk about God himself dwelling within, first the wilderness tabernacle, and then the Jerusalem temple. The Jerusalem temple was the focal point of Jewish life and faith and hope, and not least prayer. It was where God had promised to put his name, his personal presence. This became a problem in the Second Temple period after the Babylonian exile, because though the temple had been rebuilt, many didn't believe that the glorious divine presence had returned. But the early Christians claimed, and it's central to their claim about Jesus, they claimed that Israel's God had returned in the person of Jesus himself, and then in the Spirit. So here's the thing. This is in a way the most important point to get straight. The large story of Scripture within which the early Christians lived and which they saw focused on Jesus and the Spirit is not about human beings leaving earth and finding their way up to heaven. It is about God the Creator coming to live with his human creatures on earth, joining heaven and earth together as always intended. That's what happened in Jesus. The Word became flesh and tabernacled in our midst. It is what will happen in the end, in that climactic verse, Revelation 21, verse 3, when God has come to dwell with humans. Look, God has come to dwell with humans. That's where it's all going. We live in between those two, in between the incarnation, the Word made flesh, and the final denouement. We live, therefore, in the time when Paul and the other early Christians all declare that God is dwelling in our midst by his Spirit, living within and working through those who believe in Jesus. So this temple theology shapes Paul's vision of the Christian vocation. Because you see, the temple and the wilderness tabernacle before it were advance models of God's intended new cosmos. The new heavens and the new earth joined together as one. They were advance models because God's purpose was ultimately to live with humans, not just in a building, but in and as a human being, the Messiah, Jesus. And also in and as renewed, glorified, believing human beings, Jesus' faithful followers. And this was all pointing ahead to the time, the promised time, when God would renew heaven and earth themselves. You see, Romans 8 and the similar passages in the New Testament look back to those great promises of Isaiah 11, Psalm 72, and so on. Thus, when Christians are filled with God's Spirit in the present, they are not only assured that they will be raised from the dead, which is the ultimate rebuilding of the temple, if you like, but also that what God is doing is in filling them this way is what those texts say he will do for all creation in the end, when the earth is filled with God's glory as the waters cover the sea. Check out those two texts and the other ones which go in the same direction. So this is the first element of the unexpected vocation. We are called, in Romans 8, to be God's present temple, the Spirit-filled people who form an advance sign of what God intends to do for the whole world. The second element of the unexpected vocation is then the sharing in the Messiah's inheritance, which is the whole earth. Ask of me, says God to his anointed in the second psalm, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the uttermost parts of the earth, the ends of the earth, for your possession. Paul refers to that promise right at the beginning in Romans 1 and again here. And his vision in Romans 8 goes with Jesus' own vision in Matthew 28 when he's giving his final charge to the disciples. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And then he commissions his followers to implement that authority through preaching the gospel and teaching the renewed human way of life. Now, the idea of inheritance in Romans 8:17 regularly sends people to Psalm 2, which we just had up a moment ago. But people don't so often notice, and I didn't notice until it was pointed out to me by Haley Jacob, who I mentioned, is that Paul also refers here to Psalm 8. That wouldn't be a surprise. In New Testament theology, Psalm 8 is often combined with Psalms 2 and 110. And also with Daniel 7. Psalm 8, see it here, reflects the Genesis creation story, as does Romans 5-8, and particularly this passage. It speaks of God creating humans a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowning him or them with glory and honor. The verse immediately before is, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you take thought for him. Some of the translations, in order to avoid the gender-specific language there, turn it into the plural. But here we've got it, you give him dominion over the works of your hands. But it's this being crowned with glory and honor that is central here. Paul has already referred to that phrase earlier in the letter in chapter 2. And when he speaks of glory in Romans 8, this is primarily, I think, what he has in mind. And this comes as a surprise. We regularly use the word glory or glorification in terms of going to heaven in the usual Western sense. Paul, on the contrary, is thinking of the glorious and scripturally promised rule and authority which renewed humans are to have over God's creation, exactly as in Romans 5, Revelation 5, and elsewhere. And that's why in Romans 8, verses 19 to 21, creation itself is waiting for the renewed humans to appear and to take charge. Creation is on tiptoe with expectation for God's redeemed humans to be revealed. So when we are raised from the dead, we shall assume our proper responsibilities under the lordship of Jesus himself to bring his wise order into creation. Creation knows this in its bones and is eagerly awaiting it. But our glorious rule doesn't begin at that eventual moment. It is here already. If we are in the Messiah, if we are indwelt by his Spirit, if we are baptized and believing Christians, then according to Paul in various passages, we are already seated with the Messiah in the heavenly places. That isn't about escapism. That isn't about going somewhere else where the world ceases to matter. Heaven is the CEO's office. Heaven is the place from which earth gets run. We already share the Messiah's authority, his glory, in the sense of Psalm 8. And if this seems peculiar or unrealistic, what on earth can that be about? That's because we are still thinking in terms like James and John in Mark 10, where if we think of glory and authority, we think of somebody sitting at Jesus' right and left hand in his earthly glory, thinking of the ordinary style of human overlordship. Jesus' reply to James and John in Mark 10 radically redefines kingdom and glory. He says the rulers of this world bully and boss about their subjects, but we are going to do it differently. The greatest will be the least. The leader will be the slave of all, because the Son of Man did not come to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' redefinition of power and glory in terms of self-giving, loving service is then to be worked out through his followers' life and mission, as, led by the Spirit, they bring his healing rule to bear on the world. This is almost a definition of Christian mission, and it is an accurate description of the Acts of the Apostles. So the first two elements of the surprising vocation, the temple identity and the messianic inheritance, lead directly to the third vocational element, the cruciform vocation. Jesus had made this clear, Mark 8, if you want to come after me, you must take up your cross. The church has in fact been obedient to this vocation for 2,000 years, but much of that work has been below the radar of history. History tends to record the times when, so to speak, James and John have won, when Christians have tried to advance Jesus' kingdom by ordinary worldly power, or, if that didn't work, by retreating from the world into shut-off communities or escapist eschatology, or indeed both. The Romans road remains the high road between those two distortions. So Romans 8, though it is full of hope and promise and salvation and glory and love, of course, but it frames those wonderful promises within the serious warnings about suffering and sorrow. And part of the problem is that we Western Enlightenment people, we've got used to a comfortable lifestyle, and we think maybe this is something to do with the fact that we are the Christian West, so that's why we have things so easy. Don't fool ourselves. But the warnings about suffering and sorrow indeed begin with the moral life itself, as in verses 12 and 13, which we had up before, where mortification, putting to death many things that the body wants to do, is a basic Christian discipline, not because we are, after all, to be justified by works, but because we are temple people, sharing the Messiah's inheritance, led by his Spirit. And the call to the cruciform vocation then continues in verse 17. We are to share the Messiah's sufferings as the key to sharing his glory. And so Paul then in verses 18 through 25 shows how the ongoing suffering of Jesus' people forms part of the strange purpose for the redemption of all creation. The salvation that was won through Jesus' suffering is implemented for all creation through the shared and Spirit-indwelt suffering of his people. Now, we have lived often enough in a culture of Christian success stories, of motivational speakers talking about God's wonderful plan for their lives and perhaps ours as well. And, as I hinted, such talk sits well within the arrogance and over-optimism of the Western world. But it regularly screens out the suffering and puzzlement and sorrow and pain and failure and tragedy and unresolved mysteries that have in fact been going on at the same time, and which all of us know in our own lives at some level or other, and which indeed many of our Christian brothers and sisters are undergoing every day. And I'm thinking of my friend in Ukraine, but of course she stands for 1 million and more others like in the like situation. Yet according to Paul in this passage, it is those griefs rather than the apparent success stories that take us to the heart of the strange cruciform vocation. As you see, he speaks in verse 22 of the world groaning in travail. Then in verse 23 of the Messiah's people not standing away from the world and thinking, oh my goodness, it's dangerous down there, we're going to be somewhere else. No, rather, but of their sharing in that same travail, longing for the bodily resurrection in which all will be made well. And then, as we'll see in my second main point, he speaks of God's own Spirit sharing this groaning. Now, all this points ahead to verse 29, where Paul declares that we are thus to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Conformed to the image, the vocation simultaneously to be genuine image-bearing humans and to be conformed to the pattern of Jesus himself. Back to verse 17, if we suffer with him, we will be glorified with him. So this is the unexpected vocation. Romans 8 explains God's call to be genuine humans, to be temple people, to be God's dwelling place already within the present creation, sharing the messianic inheritance through the dark path of cruciformity. And this is the context within which Paul describes briefly but importantly how this complex vocation plays out in the life of prayer. And this is my second main point. I've heard it said many times in recent weeks about Ukraine, about school shootings and so on. Well, our thoughts and prayers are with these people. And then somebody's saying, it's not enough just to say our thoughts and prayers are with them. We need to go deeper. We need to think, what sort of praying should we be doing, could we be doing at a time like this? So, the paradoxical prayer life. Romans 8 verses 26 and 27, as I said, are frequently treated as an aside. Why does Paul suddenly switch tracks and stop talking about his apocalyptic vision of new creation and give us these two verses about prayer, such paradoxical verses too, in which he declares that we don't know what we ought to be praying? Surely Paul, of all people, knew what to pray for. And what has this got to do with the larger context, either of the groaning of all creation, or indeed of the assumed Romans Road subject of Romans, how sinners get saved and get into heaven at last? Well, as we've seen, that isn't what the Romans Road is about. The Romans Road leads to the messianic inheritance, which is that renewed, genuine human beings will be sharing God's work of bringing life and order into his creation. And that road passes, as we've already seen, through the valley of sorrow and tears, through places where we sense within ourselves the groaning in which, as we long for our own final redemption, we resonate with the larger groaning of all creation, with volcanic heavings and eruptions, both moral and spiritual and cultural. That's where we are right now, isn't it? In your country, in my country, in the Western world as a whole, the world as a whole. And this brings us back in our own day to the fresh challenges which we face, moral and medical. We were totally unprepared for the pandemic. The challenges social and cultural, political and personal. And when we think about all that, we may perhaps agree with Paul. Okay, we don't really know what we ought to be praying for. It's too huge. We don't know where to start. We hardly can see the beginning of a way forward. How are we to pray? And yet we urge one another to pray, and rightly so. But how does our prayer make any difference at all to the great and sometimes terrifying issues of our times? Two other lines which are in this chapter not far away from these verses may help us get a grip on the question. In verse 15, just 10 verses before, Paul says, you didn't receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. You've received the spirit of sonship when we cry, Abba, Father. But this cry, Abba, Father, isn't just the sign that we are indeed God's children, though of course it is that. It is putting us in the same place as Jesus in Gethsemane. That's when he prayed, Abba, Father. In that prayer, Jesus himself didn't know what to pray for. If it be your will. Or rather, he prayed for one thing, knowing that his Father might well say, actually, no. And then in verse 28, yes, there it is in Mark 14, that's the Abba Father prayer. Then in verse 28, right after the two verses about prayer, Paul speaks of those who love God, which is an echo of the programmatic line in chapter 5, verse 5. Hope does not make us ashamed because the love of God has been poured in our hearts through the Holy Spirit has been given to us. So in verse 28, the reference to those who love God is pointing backwards, as you see, to the mysterious prayer of unknowing in verses 26 and 27. the prayer in which we find ourselves held within the dark dialogue of the Father and the Spirit, the place where apparently, though we don't know what we should say, the Father, the searcher of hearts, knows what is happening. I'll come back to this in a moment, but it seems to me that Paul is describing the times when the followers of Jesus are doing just that, following Jesus, taking up our own cross, finding ourselves with him in Gethsemane, or even in his cry of abandonment on the cross itself. And I think perhaps that Paul's comment on that moment might have been that prayer in Gethsemane on the cross was the sign of Jesus' own utter love for the Father. And that by understanding our own moments of paradoxical prayer, when we are caught between our love for God and our perplexity about what to pray for, we might even understand something of Jesus' own moment of despair. So let's take a closer look at verses 26 and 27. Remember, in the previous verses, Paul has just spoken of the world groaning in travail, then of the church, God's people within the suffering world, also groaning in travail, as we await our resurrection bodies, which will be the sign, as with Jesus himself in Romans 1:4, that we are God's children. And he now speaks of the Spirit groaning. The Spirit intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words, but the Greek word underneath that word sighs is the same as the words for groaning in verses 22 and 23. And when he talks about the Spirit doing this, he says the Spirit comes alongside us. And the coming alongside word is the same word in Luke 10, when Martha would like Mary to come alongside and help her with her work in the kitchen. It's coming alongside to help at the moment of our utter weakness. The weakness in which, as we groan with longing for our own full redemption, we find ourselves at a loss in our praying. What should we be praying for as we think of Eastern Europe? What should we be praying for as we think of the terrible crises going on around the world? What should we be praying for in the crises in our own lives, our families, our immediate communities? Many of us have been in that state of being at a loss when faced with the challenges of these troubling times, and also with our personal sorrows. And I believe this is not accidental. It doesn't mean that we've fallen off the track somewhere. This is near the heart of our strange vocation. Now, some have proposed that Paul here in these verses is referring to praying in tongues. That is possible. But I'm not convinced. Why would he say that the groanings of the Spirit were allaleta, inarticulate, sighs too deep for words? Tongues implies that there are words going on. But there is no uncertainty in the next verse, verse 27, because at the heart of this paradoxical prayer, in which we are caught up in God's love without knowing what's happening or what to say, God himself is searching our hearts, your heart, my heart, and is discerning there the mind of the Spirit. God knows the mind of the Spirit. From our point of view, the Spirit's groanings may be inarticulate. We sense the pain and the horror of what's going on. But God the Father comes searching with his gentle but powerful searchlight to hunt around in the dark recesses of our hearts and to find there what the Spirit is thinking. And, says Paul, the Spirit is interceding for God's people, the saints, katatheon, in accordance with God's will. Those groanings of which we are aware as we come to pray in sorrow and despair, as we should do, are transformed by the Spirit into the ever-widening circle of intercession, not only for our needs, but also for the whole creation. Paul is going to refer in verse 34 to the ministry of Jesus now in his heavenly intercession. He's at the right hand of God, he's interceding for us. And that ministry of Jesus is already anticipated in our own perplexed but Spirit-filled praying. And through these intercessions, God's new world is coming to birth in its ultimate final form, and also, please God, in the multiple smaller anticipations of that final new creation, which can and will and do happen here and now through our praying. You see, intercession is not simply about sending off requests to God as to a faceless bureaucrat somewhere, knowing that he may say yes or no, but we'll never know why. The old curse of deism is still hanging around, leading us to think of prayer as a one-on-one transaction. I'm calling out to God, is he listening? I'm not sure. And intercession, on the contrary, is primarily the work of the Holy Spirit within which we are caught up. Precisely when we don't know what to pray for, when the sorrows of our hearts and the urgent needs of the world are far too big for our little minds and hearts and prayers. But when we sense deep in our hearts both the hugeness of the problems, the powerfulness of evil, and yet the longing of God himself to bring about new creation. And at that moment, Paul says, the Spirit is praying for us, interceding to the Father, and he's doing so in accordance with God's will. And when that happens, Romans 5:5 comes true. The love of God is poured out in our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. And that phrase, the love of God, can of course mean God's love for us as well as our love for God. But as verse 28 makes clear, this certainly here means our love for God. The process Paul describes is God's work of sovereign love, pouring out the Spirit into our hearts and then searching the depths of our hearts to discern what's going on there, the inarticulate groaning that emerges from our griefs and our longings, our ongoing perplexity and distress. And with that we reach the assurance of verse 28. Now, Romans 8:28 is one of those verses that I learnt as a child, many people have learnt, and you probably learnt it in something rather like the NRSV version there. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose, all things being the subject and those who love God being the happy beneficiaries of that. The RSV actually was closer to the Greek. We know that we know in fact that God works all things together for good. Oh, no, sorry, this is my problem, because that was in my translation, my published Kingdom New Testament, which I now am suggesting has to be read differently. Those of you who know the Greek may look at that verb that is highlighted, synergy, which means to work with. It's the word from which we get our word synergy. It's to do with two or more people working together. Forget the worries about synergism as in justification. That's a different topic entirely. What we have now is something quite extra, because as in 2 Corinthians 6:1, Paul is here talking about vocation, the calling of God's people to work with God on his projects. And that goes as well with the words which Paul uses to describe his fellow workers, people like Timothy, in his missionary colleagues. But he can also use it to say, as in 1 Corinthians 3:9, that we are fellow workers. That's synergoi again. We are working with God. And the translation which I'm suggesting is that God is working through and with those who love him. The reason we are called to this strange ministry of prayer is that that is how God is working his purpose out for the benefit of the world. And when we understand Genesis 1 and Psalm 8, which are obviously important in Romans 8, we see that God made his creation deliberately in such a way that he could appropriately work within it through loyal human beings. God is, I've coined a word, the deanthropic God. Deanthropos is working through humans. God is the God of creation who always intended to become part of his own creation by becoming human. And that is our glory, the amazing dignity of being human. To be by the Spirit partners, fellow workers with God in his work in the world. and perhaps never more so than in this ministry of puzzled prayer. Now, when you go back to Genesis, incarnation is in view from the start. God made humans in his own image so that he could become part of his own creation by becoming human. But so too is the biblical promise of the Spirit. In Genesis 2, God breathes into human nostrils his own breath of life. And those called to special tasks within Israel, judges and kings and priests and prophets, were equipped with special fillings of God's Spirit. But God promised that one day he would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh, not simply to save and sanctify them, but so that what God would accomplish uniquely through his incarnate Son would then be implemented through the Son's Spirit-filled followers. That is our vocation. And of course, we fulfill that calling in 1,000 different ways. By being Sermon on the Mount people, humble, meek, mourners, pure in heart, hungry for justice, and so on. But here, Paul focuses on the prayer that echoes in the dark recesses of our hearts, when we long to pray, but have no idea what to pray for or how to go about it. God, the heart searcher, shining his searchlight, finds in our sorrows and uncertainties that his own Spirit is at work right there, interceding with groans that we don't understand, but that he appears to. And that is part of what he then means by those who love God, when we find ourselves like Jesus, praying the Abba prayer in every new Gethsemane, whether at a graveside or in a hospital ward, or watching the national or international news and seeing horror and tragedy all around. Our vocation is to stand at that place of intercession, allowing the Spirit to intercede right there, knowing that even if we don't understand, God the Father is searching the depths of our hearts to see what the Spirit is saying in the Spirit's intercession. And as that happens, and this is the crunch of the verse, Paul declares this is how God is working all things for good. He is working, this is the translation I would offer you, he is working with and through those who love him, those who are called according to his purpose, like Jesus himself, are marked out as God's Son, who are the humans through whom God's will is coming to pass. Now, had humans never sinned, then it would no doubt have been a happy and glorious task for the incarnate Son to come into the world and bring creation to its intended full flourishing. But granted human sin, the suffering and death of Jesus was the mode that his incarnation had to take to bring about that same result. And now, the groaning and interceding in which we are caught up is the mode our own human instrumentality must take to bring that purpose to full completion. That is what Paul means by God working all things for good with and through those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. So God is saying, in effect, I am recruiting humans to a deep, dark human task to share with me in the rescue, repair, and renewal of the world. And for this, they must take up their cross and follow my Son, praying, Abba, Father, like he did. Does that or does that not sound like what Jesus was talking about in Mark 8? And so briefly, in this section, to verses 29 and 30. Those whom God foreknew as he foreknew poor old Jeremiah. I knew you before you were born. I appointed you to a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah says, no, please, anybody else, not me. No, this is what you were made for. Those whom he foreknew, he marked out in advance to be shaped according to the model of the image of his Son. It's a vocation full of glory, but it is the glory which, as John said, reached its full revelation on the cross. These verses, I suggest, are not about a step-by-step route to salvation in the normal sense. Of course, salvation is fully and clearly in view, but the Roman road that leads you to salvation passes through the dark valley, whose heart is the Abba prayer, the Gethsemane prayer. the paradoxical prayer of unknowing, the prayer in which God the Spirit intercedes from the depths of the grieving human heart, and God the heart searcher translates those inarticulate groanings into the perfect language of his love. All this leads me to a final reflection, which could be expanded almost indefinitely, and I just give it very briefly here. Paul announces in the opening chapter of Romans that the road he is taking us is the revelation of God's righteousness, that is, God's covenant justice. But by the end of Romans 8, Paul's focus is on the unbreakable love of God, but he hasn't changed the subject. Some people think of righteousness as a cold justice as opposed to the warm-hearted love. No, righteousness is God's faithfulness to the covenant. It's God's loving faithfulness to the covenant with Abraham, which was God's chosen means of putting the whole world right, lovingly reaffirming the goodness of his creation and of his image-bearing human creatures, and rescuing them from sin and death to share in his new creation. So when we talk, as theologians do, about God's attributes, God's righteousness, God's holiness, God's mercy, God's love, and so on, we ought to recognize that these are abstractions pointing to something personal and also narratival, the inner life of God the Trinity, and the story of how this Creator God has rescued and is rescuing humans and, through them, the world. Now, of course, Paul doesn't use the word Trinity itself, but there are many signs in his writing that he almost takes for granted what we might call the triple personality of the one God. And Romans 8 is one of those passages. And here I suggest we have what I've called the dark disclosure of God and God's purposes, the inner life of God himself. The Romans road leads us through dark pathways into the very mystery of God. How do we think about God? Many Christians have learned a version of divine sovereignty, often focusing on the wrong translation of Romans 8, in which God is simply the most powerful being in the universe who can and does do anything he wants. This raises all sorts of questions. Well, why doesn't he stop wars? Why doesn't he cure cancer, and so on? Those are usually swept aside with the assurance that God's ways are different from ours, and that, as in the usual translation which you have there, God works all things for good to those who love him, instead of what I've been saying to you, that it's through or with those who love him. But in recent generations, many people have stopped believing in that God who is like a sort of puppet master pulling the strings of the world, and have developed something which they've called process theology, again suggesting that God is part of the process of the world, caught up himself in its uncertainties and unknown outcomes. And that goes with the modern stress, particularly since Jürgen Moltmann's work, The Crucified God, on the suffering of God, seen especially in the death of Jesus. Now, classical theologians have pushed back against that suggestion, but if we take the four Gospels seriously in their portrayal of Jesus as the human embodiment of Israel's God, then the anguish of Jesus in Gethsemane, and the equivalent passage in John 12 as well, must point to some sense of sorrow and suffering being part of the lived experience of the one true God himself. Now, some have tried to hold that at bay through a split Christology, with Jesus effectively having two minds, so that he's sort of divine over on one side and then human over on the other, and somehow we get away with it. That is so counterintuitive to any serious reader of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that we have to find better ways forward. Here, Paul opens up a fully Trinitarian vision of God, and insists that we, puzzled and often grieving believers, are not spectators of or theoreticians of this view, but are caught up within it. Insofar as God the Father remains, of course, sovereign over all things, he has chosen, as in Genesis 1 itself, to exercise this sovereignty, as I said before, deanthropically, through his image-bearing human creatures. That's how God chose to work in the world, and he never rescinded that decision. And that's why in verse 29 he speaks of being conformed to the image of the Son, making Messiah Jesus the firstborn in a large and growing family. Because granted human sin and the groaning and corruption of all creation, the way God exercises his saving sovereignty is through suffering love. The suffering love of Jesus himself. And now the suffering love of those who find themselves caught up in creation's pain. And within that, the pain of the church. So instead of avoiding the pain by pretending it doesn't exist, or seeing God simply as a kind of Superman who will zap it all into shape, Paul insists that precisely when we're at our wits' end, with grief or fear or anxiety, and when we nevertheless stand before God in that state of unknowing and lament, at that very moment, the Spirit is groaning within us, and the Spirit's mind is fully known to God the heart searcher. That's a lovely image which Paul draws from Psalm 44. He knows the secrets of the heart. He's going to quote the last verse of Psalm 44 just later on in the passage. He's got it in mind all the way through. Remember that in Romans 8 the Spirit is playing the role of the glorious divine presence in the wilderness tabernacle, God himself dwelling amidst his people, and the God who dwells within us by his Spirit. Paul has already said in 5:5, pours out within us the love for himself, which we now discover expresses in itself the prayer of unknowing lament. So here is the tri-personality and narrative meaning of God. God has promised to fill the world with his knowledge and glory. And the advanced form with which this filling takes is the pouring out of the Spirit into the hearts of believers, enabling them not indeed to stride through life without a care in the world. Oh, God's on my side, so it's all going to be all right. No, but precisely to stand before God with the cares of the world in our hearts. Like Aaron going into the Holy of Holies with the 12 tribes on his breastplate, but now as the royal priesthood sharing the groaning of all creation, so that the Spirit's intercession will be taking forward the work of ultimate redemption. And those who are caught up within this conversation between the Father and the Spirit are therefore shaped according to the image of the Son. Not only is this passage comforting in the way that an abstract statement about divine sovereignty can never be, it shows that the Romans road has led us not so much to a QED about God's unstoppable power, as these verses are often read, but to the vocation, the summons to be in our praying, especially in our dark and sorrowful praying, part of the very means by which God's purposes for creation are worked out. Somehow, the mystery of the Trinity with typical paradox is something we know best at the moment when we don't know what's going on. God is neither a distant dictator pulling the strings of a puppet show, nor a passive participant swept along by the tide of events. God is the tri-personal mystery in whose rescuing purposes for creation we are invited to share. So to conclude, some very brief words about lament and hope and victory. The Romans road has led us to a place both of lament and of hope. As I said 2 years ago in my little book, when the pandemic struck, the primary Christian response to any such event, as now to the horror going on in Ukraine, or to the raw wounds of small children lying dead on a schoolroom floor, the primary response must be lament. It's all too easy to jump to conclusions, to say either that this new event is a punishment for some obvious sin, or whatever, or that it's part of a chain of events leading to the last days. Those responses are often indicative of a failure of either humility or patience or both, as are the responses which simply repeat shrill or divisive slogans. But for those who walk all the way along the Romans road, the first thing at least will be to admit we don't know what to pray for. And our task then is to stay in the mode of lament. Psalm 44 would be a great place to start. To bring the pain and uncertainty of the present time before God within the Abba Father relationship. Like the author of Psalm 44, we must be prepared to lay the hard questions at God's door and to stay there in patient humility, expressing our grief and anger perhaps, frustration certainly, knowing that the heart searcher is holding on to us within the mystery of the Trinity, and knowing in particular that through our puzzled praying, he will work with us, with those who love him, for good. So lament is the first proper response to the pain of the world, whether globally or locally or in our own hearts. It doesn't try to tell God what he should do next. It simply expresses the pain and hurt and grief and puzzlement of our hearts. Our churches need to rediscover the discipline of lament. Many worshipping communities today, including some of the most vibrant ones, have stopped using the Psalms, which is a bad sign because they are the primary biblical resource. They were, after all, the prayer book of the Jesus whom Isaiah refers to as the man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We need to help one another to inhabit in prayer and liturgy the lament strand of biblical worship. Otherwise, we run the risk of allowing the arrogance of secular culture, which imagines that it knows how the world works, to spill over into Christian practice, as though when faced with sorrow or wickedness, we just have to wave the traditional reading of Romans 8:28 and all will be well. No. Romans 8, at the dark heart of the Romans road, tells us that if by the Spirit we really are God lovers, one of our primary tasks is lament. But lament is the seedbed of hope. As we saw when Paul says in 8:28, those who learn to pray in that dark place are those who love God. He is echoing chapter 5, verse 5, and there he said that when God's love is poured out in our hearts by the Spirit, then hope does not disappoint us. The hope ultimately is for new creation itself and for our own resurrection within that. And our prayer itself, the prayer of lament in the dark, the prayer to which the Romans road has led us, is part of the means by which God's purposes of new creation will be fulfilled. Hope is not passive. It's not just dreaming of a possible future. Precisely in our lament and in our prayer of unknowing, we are becoming people of hope. People whose puzzling prayer life is itself a sign of inaugurated eschatology, a sign that God has begun to fulfill his age-old promise that he would at last come and dwell with his people. He is here. He is groaning within our hearts. That's the sign of what he's going to do for the whole creation. So that glorious statement in Revelation 21:3 is fulfilled already in advance of the final redemption. First, of course, in Jesus, the God with us human, but now through the Spirit. So even though the Spirit seems to share our perplexity in the Spirit's inarticulate groanings, the very fact that this is taking place is already the sure sign, as also part of the means, that God will one day fill his whole creation with love and glory and knowledge as the waters cover the sea. So here to repeat is the point. Our present perplexed prayer life is part of the means by which that new creational purpose is worked out, because we know that with and through those who thus love God, God works all things for good. And the string of dramatic verbs in verses 29 and 30, foreknowledge, marking out in advance, shaping, calling, justification, all these are means to this end, that in this very dark moment of perplexed, lamenting prayer, we might share in the divine work of making all things new. That is our glory, as in Psalm 8. It is our vocation as the royal priesthood. It is our human vocation and God-given dignity. Now, of course, the Roman road goes further still. It continues in verses 31 to 39 with the shout of triumph and the celebration of God's unbreakable love, both of them known precisely in the midst of trouble and suffering. Verse 37, it is in all these things that we are more than conquerors, that we are completely victorious. In all these things, not by avoiding them, not even despite them, as though they could be pushed to one side to make room for a victory which is quite different. No, the love of God in Messiah Jesus our Lord, from which nothing can separate us, is the intimate relationship we already have at the dark heart of the Romans road, when by the Spirit we find ourselves praying in grief and sorrow, aware that God, the heart searcher, knows precisely what's going on, and is even now accomplishing the work of rescue and renewal, which will result in the redemption of all creation and ourselves within it. That is our glory, the fulfillment of our human vocation. Jesus himself went this road of sorrow and pain before us, and thereby overcame evil and death itself. And he bequeaths to us, by his Spirit, the vocation of implementing that achievement, standing in prayer at the place where the world is in pain, knowing that he himself, as in verse 34, is standing in prayer for us at the Father's right hand. The Romans road is long and hard, and it brings us to a dark place, but there we find ourselves at the heart of the mystery of God himself, at the place of our own continuing vocation as people of prayer, at the place where we celebrate the hope of God's glory, at the place where the victory of the cross is made real, even in the darkness of the present time. Should we just pause and pray as we think about this? There's a song which says, "Thank you, O my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving your Spirit till the work on earth is done." Thank you, Father, for Paul, for Romans, for this chapter, for these extraordinary, heart-searching truths. We pray that you will give us faith and patience to be people of prayer at the place where the world is in pain. And that as we sense the love for you, answering your love for us, welling up in our hearts, that you will give us the confidence that you are working with us to bring about your good purposes. We pray for our nations, we pray for our world, we pray for those in pain tonight. We lay before you the sorrows of our own hearts. And we thank you that in this moment of prayer and lament, you, Father, the heart searcher, know what is the mind of the Spirit. So be with us and continue to teach us and make us and more of your people of prayer to share in your work, because we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, questions are coming in. I like these first two, but they're really, really long. Thank you, Charles. Question, quote, "His Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are his children, and so we cry out, Abba, Father," close quote. Here's the question. How are we to understand or explain this distinction between his Spirit and our spirit? What is meant by our spirit?
That's a great question. Paul talks about the human spirit here and in 1 Corinthians when he says that nobody knows what's going on in a person's heart except the spirit of the person. And so likewise, only the Spirit of God knows God's inner self. And he says, we have received the Spirit of which is from God. That's in 1 Corinthians. And here, the Spirit bears witness with our spirit. It's as though the deepest interiority of ourselves as humans is designed to be resonant with what God's own Spirit wants to do within us. I think that probably goes back to Genesis 2 as well, about God breathing his breath into human nostrils, that the ordinary human breath or nephesh, which the humans have, is designed to be in sympathy with God. Obviously for most people, most of the time, that's at best an aspiration, and often much worse than that. But ideally, when the Spirit is doing that, we know in ourselves, and the Spirit is telling us, and there is a kind of convergence between the two. And I don't think Paul reckons you can get a razor blade between them. It's something that we deeply know in our bones, as we might say, is what in fact the Spirit is telling us at that point.
All right, next. Without denying glory as speaking about human vocation, doesn't glory primarily mean God's immortal presence? And they reference Romans 1:23, comparing the glory of an immortal God to mortal images. Romans 2:7, seek glory, honor, and immortality. 6:4, raised to life through the glory of the Father.
Yeah, sure. The Greek word glory, doxa, and the Hebrew kavod, which underlies it, are multivalent. They do all sorts of jobs. In this passage, as actually in 2:6, which was quoted there, it is a reference to Psalm 8, glory and honor. That's crowned with glory and honor, with all things put under their feet. I think I didn't have a chance to draw this out as fully as I would like in this lecture, but I think in Romans 8 what we see is two things coming exactly together, and rather as with the Spirit and the Spirit, if you like. On the one hand, all the things that I said about the human vocation to be God's vicegerents, if you like, but also through the temple theme, the temple is where the divine glory comes to dwell. If we are God's temple, then it is God's glory dwelling within us, enabling us to be genuine humans. This is so difficult for us post-Enlightenment Westerners to imagine, because we've separated in our minds God and humans so far from one another that we have failed to realize the intimacy which was implied in the vocation to be image bearers. But the two do come together.
Short one. What are your favorite commentaries on Romans?
Oh, goodness.
Other than your own.
Other than my own, thank you. Yeah, well, no.
I took the humility that you would have said.
No, my own have many. There are many things which I now think about Romans which aren't in any of my previous writings. As I say, it goes on astonishing me. It depends what I want a commentary for, and sometimes if I'm writing a scholarly article, then there are the big fat ones by people like Robert Jewett in 2007, and the much older ones like Sandy and Headlam from 100 years ago. But at a popular level, there's a splendid recent book by Scott McKnight called Reading Romans Backwards, which isn't exactly a commentary, but it's saying, hang on, look at chapters 14 and 15. If that's where the letter is going, then think what the rest of it must mean, and so on. So, whenever I have to do any more work on Romans, there are about 10 or 15 books which routinely come off the shelf, and I'm leafing through them.
I really like this question. How do we convince that doesn't mean I didn't like those other ones. I don't anybody take that negative. How do we convince ourselves and others that lament is a discipline and not a sign of weak faith?
Yeah. The straightforward answer would be because of the Psalms on the one hand, and because of Jesus' use of the Psalms of lament on the other. There's another question coming in as we speak. In John 12, Jesus says, "Now is my soul troubled," which, if I mistake not, comes out of Psalm 42 and 43, which is, the one psalm which is all about like as the heart desires the water brooks, etc. Why are you so troubled, O my soul? If Jesus himself prayed the prayers of lament, and climactically, of course, Psalm 22, my God, why did you abandon me? Then either we say this cannot be a sign of weak faith, or we want to say that Jesus had weak faith, which I suspect we don't want to say. But Jesus' faith included faith in the darkness of Gethsemane and on the cross itself. And I think we are worried about that because of our modern arrogance, we assume that we're supposed to be strong and able to do whatever it takes. And to have to say, no, we can't, we don't know what's going on here, is painful, it's humbling, but it's part of who we are.
So, and I keep coming back to the chapel, to this chapel, because of what you're saying. So the Byzantines laid it out in a cross shape, cruciform, but they would elevate right here, because if Jesus were on this cross, this is where his heart would be. And it was their way of saying Jesus on the cross, his heart was as close to heaven as a human has ever been, as he was perfectly human as well as perfectly divine. In that act on the cross, we see it demonstrably. So I had painted up there Isaiah 40 verse 3, prepare the way of the Lord, of Adonai, of Yahweh, with the idea, the word for road, prepare the way, is just the word road. The road that Christ took is the road for us. It is the road of the cross. That is where we are closest to heaven, in Lament and all that's entailed in that road. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't have to repaint. Humility seems to be our natural state of being on our journey along the Roman road. Our humility is God's presence.
The more we're aware of God's presence, the more humility is likely to break out despite ourselves. And C.S. Lewis has that lovely line about humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less, which is a typical Lewis line.
Romans 8:21, let's see how we're doing time-wise. We've got 5 more minutes, then we have 2 of his books for sale that are here. Charles, what are they? I don't have my glasses. Oh wait, I've got them right here, hold on. Okay, Broken Signposts, How Christianity Makes Sense of the World. What's this about?
I'm surprised this book is so thin, because when I tell you what it's about 7 major features of all human experience, or aspiration, like justice, beauty, love, and so on, and about how we all mess them all up, and how when we understand how that happens, we discover that we land up at the foot of the cross, and that actually. And this is also a meditation on John's Gospel, actually. I need to make that clear, that these themes are all Johannine themes, love and justice and so on, and how recognizing the way our human aspirations let us down is actually paradoxically a way of saying the gospel itself addresses a world which knows we want justice, but we can't seem to do it. We want relationships, but we can't seem to do them. So it's both an apologia and a meditation on John's Gospel, and quite personal in some ways.
And our people work really, really, really hard to get the best price they can on these and to pass that on to you. So this is, I think, Charles, did you say $11? And that's tax, title, and license. And then one of my favorite books of yours.
Thank you.
This is Paul, a biography, and you can read great theology of Paul written for scholars, or you can read great information and theology of Paul written for everybody. And that's what this is. And it's a hardback. It's a great, great book, and we've got it for $20, and that's like half price. So, bargain. All right, we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and I'm sorry about this, but if you'll come tomorrow to class, I'll see if I can cover some of these. What is your translation of Romans 8:28 slowly?
Okay. Thank you. Part of the difficulty is that getting the Greek married up, I'm not sure that we can do it now on this, getting the Greek is important, because Paul uses the phrase which means with those who love God right at the front of the verse. So it's, we know that with those who love God, God works all things with them for good. Yes, God works with those who love God. So that still sounds muddled, I'm sorry. each time I've tried to write it out, I experiment with different versions. But it's basically, we know that with those who love God, God works for good. So that the those who love God is a reference back to this prayer in the previous 2 verses, so that we know that the way God is doing what he wants to do in the world is taking us, and specifically that prayer, into his purposes to accomplish what he wants to do.
So God doesn't say to us, hey, go pray and fix the world. Good luck, Skippy. Tell me when you're done.
Yeah.
He says, I'm doing this with you.
Yeah. That the Spirit's work enables us to be God's agents in his world in ways that we don't understand, but we have to be faithful in prayer to do that.
Okay, and just to end on another note, are you happy or sad to miss the hubbub festivities taking place in London this weekend?
Well, I wouldn't have been planning to be in London. I would have watched it on television with my family at home. But I was slightly sad when I realized, but this was set up ages ago, like this was set up 2 years ago, as you know. So I've been waiting for this, not as long as the Queen has been waiting for her Jubilee, but I was in London and in Pall Mall for the 50th, for her 50th anniversary 20 years ago, and I remember that vividly. It was a wonderful occasion. So when I saw it on television, I thought, I paid my dues to that stuff already, which was fine.
Okay, great Queen stories that I'm going to ask him about tomorrow in class. But right now, let's let him get over there. And I'm going to warn you now, everybody, all 600 of you would love to talk to him. He's jet lagged. He just got in from England, and it's like 3 a.m. to him. And we want him to come back for a 5th time. So if you manage to have that limited window where he signs your book, please move through with rapidity. He's a very kind and gracious man who would want to be kind and gracious, but I'm going to be protective of his health, which means we need to get him in bed tonight early enough to make class tomorrow. So let him leave now and join me in thanking him as you leave.